is that in a couple of spots it'll show spelling differences and so on, but that's okay. All right, so what I want to do is basically break down the divisions between qualitative and quantitative approaches to research and just give you a different way of thinking about using methods, essentially. And okay, so I start from the assumption that the phenomena we study, well, not an assumption, the observation really, that the phenomena we study have both qualities and quantities. So when we, any particular thing we're studying, you can describe in terms of its qualities, its quantities, but also in terms of time or space, maybe sounds, colors. They have emotional, historical, or cultural significance. So the point I want to make here simply is that any phenomena we study, or any phenomenon we study, is multidimensional. That means we need words and numbers, and perhaps also other means to record our observations. The problem then is that our research traditions portray a divided two-dimensional world rather than a multi-dimensional one. Our research traditions divide things, or have divided things into things that can be counted and things that can be described in text, basically, quantitative approaches to and qualitative approaches. We've constructed a divide and we impose it on the phenomena we study. We impose it through our methods training and our research texts and our requirements for publication. Methods training is typically you will do a course on quantitative methods, you'll do a course on qualitative methods, rather than a course on just doing research. And so data and methods get boxed into contrasting qual and quant terms. If you look at textbooks on research that cover both qualitative and quantitative methods, or even ones that cover one type, they'll often start with making a list of the so-called differences between these approaches. So they'll have a list of qualitative characteristics, a list of quantitative characteristics, set out in contrasting terms. When I went through some years ago a series of books and articles and listed all of the ways that they differentiated qualitative and quantitative methods, I came up with 40 different ways in which various authors had differentiated qual and quant methods. The problem is that the boxes reinforce the divisions. And I'm arguing that in order to study, to look at the, or effectively picture the phenomena we're studying, we need dimensions, because phenomena are multidimensional. So we need multidimensional methods. The problem too is that the descriptors used to distinguish the different approaches don't stay in their boxes. So an exploratory study can use numeric methods for recording data and even statistics. A confirmatory study, you can confirm a hypothesis using qualitative methods, perhaps even a case study to use a confirmation of a hypothesis. So things don't stick neatly in their boxes. You can do inductive research with numbers. You can do deductive research with text. It's, yeah, so the divisions just don't work. It's better to see each of these ways of describing research as a sort of continuum, and many studies sit somewhere along each of these continuums. They don't sit all at one end or all at the other. Nevertheless, we do have a sense of and can we do attempt to describe quant and qual research, but inevitably our attempts to do so can be challenged. So if someone says that qualitative research is inductive, it's possible to challenge that and say, yeah, not always. Or numbers mean that you are being positivist and deductive. Well, not always. Numbers can be used in an inductive way. So those divisions can be challenged, and in fact, studies often sit somewhere on the continuum between each of those characteristics. And remember, I've just listed a few there, and there are anywhere up to 40 of them. So dimensions don't have a clear dividing, or don't create or have a clear dividing boundary. And Max Bergman described qualitative and quantitative approaches as being like two interrelated families that have many common or overlapping features. Or another way to think about it is to think of a pond in a field, and the boundary is muddy, but you can still identify the pond and the field. So you can see the pond and you can see the field, and you've got the muddy area in between, and that can be valuable too. So think, for instance, of where you'd grow rice or papyrus. It would be in that muddy area. Methods similarly, you can potentially identify something as being a largely quantitative approach or a largely qualitative approach, but there's a huge big area in between that, for argument's sake, we'll just call mixed or hybrid. If a study has sufficient, and this is working on the concept of sufficiency, if a study has sufficient functionally compatible characteristics at the same pole, then the approach taken can meet a family resemblance criterion and be described as broadly qualitative or quantitative. So if I just skip backwards to there and imagine your 40-odd characteristics, and the problem is how many is sufficient. But if you say that the study, these are the things that tend to be associated with one or the other approach. And so if you have sufficient and they are functionally compatible that are listed under what I've got under the qualitative end of the pole, then we could recognise that as taking a qualitative approach. And similarly, on the opposite pole, we could recognise it as being a quantitative approach. And as I said, most studies seem to end up in the muddy bit in between. So I don't completely dismiss the use of qualitative and quantitative as terms, but I apply them to just broad approaches rather than anything more definitive than that. The lack of clear boundaries between them, and they are very, very unclear, means or implies that when we're thinking about data, it's best to think about selecting data on the basis of what's needed rather than type. I'd argue also what's accessible. So if I'm wanting to study something and set up a project, I'm going to be looking for what kind of data can I use to answer the questions that I'm asking, and what kind of data can I actually get hold of? What data is accessible? And these different data will reflect the multidimensionality of the phenomenon that I'm studying. So we use diverse data and methods, and yet at the same time, we're working towards a common purpose or goal. So you have different methods, but within a common purpose. In order to reach that goal, those methods will become interdependent in order to reach the goal. Otherwise, it's going to be a project that's split in some way. It's not going to reach a clear answer if these different methods are in fact telling you about different things rather than the same thing. So opens up the potential for a more complete study, a more complete picture, but also possibly conflicting results. In that same journal as my Mixed Methods in My Bones article appeared, there's also an article right next to it, actually, by Gorod and Siddiqui, which they call There Is Only Research. And it's another great one to read. But basically, they're arguing, forget about trying to set up a quantitative study or a qualitative study. Just think about, you are doing research. What data is going to help you answer your question? The problem then is that standard definitions of mixed methods research, which is where we end up in, emphasize that it's a combination of qualitative and quantitative research approaches. And so these definitions bridge the qualitative-quantitative divide by saying we need to combine these, but they don't actually transcend it. They perpetuate the divide. And so many particular methods, I mean, any qualitative approach covers a whole range of different kinds of methods and different kinds of data. You might have interview data, you might have documentary data, you might have observational data, you might use case study, you might use ethnography, you might use grounded theory. There's so many different variations within qualitative work, and similarly within quantitative work. You have numbers and statistics, and you may use inferential statistics, or you may use other kinds of statistics, or you might not use statistics at all. You might simply describe in numeric terms, and you can use experimental data, or you can use regression type analyses and so on. So there are different ways of doing so-called qualitative research. There are different ways of doing so-called quantitative research. So there's as much variation within each of those broad approaches almost as there is between them. And yet the definitions that are offered by the classic mixed methods literature is that you have to combine qual plus quant. As I suggest, is that these are reinforcing the divide by insisting on those labels. It may be quite possible that you use two very different qualitative methods or two very different quantitative methods. And I would still consider that that's still likely to generate what I would call a mixed methods project. So I am I don't agree with that distinction. If we look historically, research traditions have shifted over time. And so earlier times, methods for recording data were just selected to fit purpose. And they weren't necessarily challenged as to type. There certainly wasn't, you had to fit within a quantitative paradigm, or you had to fit within a qualitative approach, or it was a pattern of selecting data according to what was needed. In the middle of last century, or around about that time, the social sciences got very concerned to emulate the natural and clinical sciences. And so they developed an approach of using what they called objective, empiricist, quantitative methods. And this, in fact, was the dominant way of thinking about things when I started my university studies. And it was just unquestioned. That's what you did. You were objective, and you empiricist, and you used statistics and so on. Around about the 1970s, there were challenges to this hegemony of quantitative methods. Gruber and Lincoln were perhaps leaders in that area. That they argued that there were there was a naturalistic alternative that these methods reduced phenomena in an artificial way, and that we needed alternative methods to study them. Towards the end of the last century, then, the mixed methods movement challenged those divisions and talked about combining methods, but it also reinforces them, as I noted earlier, through the language used and through publication requirements, such as for the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, that says you have to have a quant and a qual method in your article. I've had arguments with the editors about that, by the way. Okay, so let's think then about the methods that we actually use to transform phenomena into data. Doing so is, the process of transforming phenomena into data is to make them visible for us, for research. It involves layers of interpretation. So we have interpretation in terms of the data that we select or construct, in choosing what we will look at and how we will look at it. We have interpretation occurring as we analyse and convert those into evidence. Text, numbers, and any other form of data can be treated as representing reality, and reported descriptively as what is. Or it can be treated as respondents' constructions to be reinterpreted by the researcher. Even when you're reporting something and saying it's representing reality, there is still that interpretation going on the part of the researcher in terms of how they select that data and how they report it and what they see as being what is. So I would argue then that all forms of data are given meaning through theoretical and cultural conventions, and in particular, I argue that all data require interpretation. So the way forward to me is to use multiple forms of representation, but recognising that whatever you use requires interpretation. If you see things this way, you can approach analysis of different forms of data from within a unified perspective. And you choose whatever data are fit for purpose, regardless of type. It also means we're likely to use multiple or mixed methods. Just a word on the ontological, epistemological, paradigmatic arguments. There's a wonderful chapter in a book I read actually very recently, although it was written a while ago, saying that your paradigmatic, your ontology and epistemology is a skin that you have, not a jumper you put on and take off. And this is another place where I have a difference of opinion with a number of the eminent mixed methods researchers who talk about taking a dialectical or approach. My argument is that I have a particular way of thinking about the nature of being, of the world, and an understanding of how we can gather evidence about that world. And I don't change it. That's my viewpoint. And so that affects how I think about things. It's not something I can put aside and take a different approach. I can't swap from being, well, basically I fit within a fairly realist way of viewing things, which means that I see that the world, there's an existence beyond my knowledge of it, but that I construct my understanding of that. That's my approach. I can't put that aside and take a different approach. Just I can understand a different approach, but when I'm doing research, that's the approach I take. So yeah, so it's a skin that I wear, not a jumper I take off. So I propose an alternative definition of mixed methods. Remember the ones that I mentioned before emphasize that you're combining a qual and a quant method. My alternative definition suggests that you need to be able to capture the multiple dimensions and build them together to represent the coherence of the whole. And so my definition of mixed methods emphasizes that you will use either more than one source or type of data or more than one approach to analysis of those data. And it is possible to have a single source but analyze it in different ways and still, in my definition, fit my definition of mixed methods. The key to my definition is that these different sources of data or approaches to analysis are integrated throughout the study in such a way as to become interdependent in reaching a common theoretical or research goal. So clearly there has to be a common purpose and goal, and whatever methods, forms of data and methods you use at various stages in the research need to be integrated to achieve that goal. So integration is the key, not whether particular kinds of data or methods of analysis are used. So it's just doing research, but making sure that the different elements of that research are brought together and tied together. Integration, if you note the other key word that was in that definition, is integration is seen, in my view, as interdependence. That means that any approach or methodology or method used without input from another will be inadequate to achieve the purpose of the research. So each is influenced by or dependent on the other. So that's stronger than simply linking or bringing together different analyses at the conclusion of a study. In fact, my differentiation between a mixed method study and a multi-method study hinges around that idea, that a multi-method study to me is you've used multiple methods, but they tend to just be maybe brought together in terms of the conclusion that's drawn at the end of the study. And they're not integrated at all on the way through. They're not interdependent, but each contributes ideas to the conclusion. Whereas a mixed method study, there is an interdependence on the way through, as well as informing the conclusions. Think of the interdependence, if you like, as the two strands of DNA, as information is shared between them through protein transfer. So then the question becomes one of designing for integration. And so we need to plan questions, data sources, samples, management, analysis strategies, and so on, eventual reporting, all with integration in mind. I would argue that questions focus on the topic or problem to be solved, not the methods. I, again, differ from some of my colleagues who talk about having a quantitative question, a qualitative question, and then a mixed question. Usually all that's needed is the question, and then you have different elements that need to be explored in order to answer that question. But that doesn't mean you have a quant and a qual question as well. So the questions need to focus on the topic. In fact, that's going to be one of my themes all the way through. We focus on the topic or the problem to be solved. And the methods are simply what we used in order to achieve that. That means that data sources are judged by relevance rather than form. Is this going to help me answer my question? Is much more important, a much more important thing to consider than whether it's a quantitative or a qualitative method. Samples can be aligned by topic. The kinds of samples and data I should have there really, the kinds of data you collect and the samples you collect them from may be covering different parts of the topic, but they will come together around the topic. So they each contribute to the topic as a whole. Samples may also be connected by case, so that you will have different kinds of data linked by the case. In other words, the unit of analysis that you're using, typically a person, but it might be an organisation or whatever, a site or something. And you'll have different kinds of data about each of the cases in your study, but they'll be linked through that case. Essentially, research is a planned, you plan a research project, but it's not linear. You design, but expect to adapt. I can't think of any research project much that has followed exactly, my experience is, I should say, that research projects rarely follow exactly from the initial expectations, that you will need to adapt according to partly to what data you are able to obtain, but also based on the things that you're finding out from that data, that you will need to, you find that you need to modify your question, or at least modify the way you're going to answer it. So if we take the assumption that we can use all sorts of different data, but these need to be integrated, then we have a range of integrative strategies that are needed in order to achieve this. And I'm going to kind of go through this reasonably quickly, but we'll see how we go. I'm conscious of time here. So let's start with an overview. And so I'm arguing that integration occurs primarily when you combine data in complementary analyses. So combination of some sort is the key. And here, key component or strategy within integration, but it's supported by other processes of conversing across approaches and methods, and I'll expand on each of these slightly as we go forward. Constructing one method based on another, comparing across data types and sources, converting data from one form to another. So these processes all contribute, but ultimately each of them then has to lead into a form of combination. So this is the combination is the key here, and these other processes lead into it. And ultimately, your results need to be compiled and conveyed in a report, again, back to my theme, organised by substantive content rather than method. I get quite annoyed when someone presents, here are the results of my statistical analyses, here are the themes from my qualitative data, and they are presented in two separate sets of results. And my argument is that the topic should be broken down into its subcomponents, and then you pull together whatever data you have for each of those subcomponents. So how do we get there? There's various ways of combining data and analyses. The simplest has been described like sprinkles on an ice cream to some extent. The simplest way is to just add or extend. So you might illustrate one method with data from another, or enhance or explain or contextualize. So you'll add bits of data of a different kind to extend or illustrate what you're talking about. You can take that a level further by composing, weaving together different kinds of data to compose a narrative account that will include both numbers and text, or illustrations or whatever else shape your data is taking. These might become merged so that you no longer can see the individual sources, but you see the result of the thinking that arises out of them. Or you can have different bits and pieces that fit together to complete a picture, rather like a jigsaw. The third general group of ways of combining data are to use the different sources to confirm or validate each other, or to compare and converge. All of these are aided by keeping combined records or results organised by topic in an integrated database. Back in before the days of qualitative computer programs, I used to have a note. I would keep a notebook in which, in fact, that was back in the days before computerization. When I was doing my PhD, I had a notebook, and for each aspect of what I was writing about, I would have a page where I'd have statistical results and observations and interview comments and so on, all under that topic heading, so that the results were gathered according to the component of the topic rather than the method used to get them. And this meant when I wrote it up, and this is even back in the 1970s, when I wrote it up, it was written up in an integrated way. Didn't realise it at the time, but I was doing mixed methods. So this, in fact, is data from my PhD back in the 1970s, and I had all different kinds of data. I had social indicator data, I had census data, I had counts, and I had observations, and I had interviews with a range of different people, and I had survey data of mixed types. And this was all woven together to build a comprehensive picture. The point here is that the sources, you can still distinguish the sources of each particular element of the data that is presented, but it's woven together to build a narrative or a picture. In a different form, some work I'm doing at the moment involves, again, drawing on multiple different kinds of data. But out of it, I have been modelling or theorising the concept of well-being for older women and what that means. And when I look at the model I'm developing, there's no clear connection between components of that model and particular sources of data. That multiple sources of data have contributed to the ideas that have gone into that model. So that's what I mean by merging. So it's another form of combination. Right, moving through some of the supportive methods, it's important to have this conversation going on between methods throughout a study, which occurs through reflection or through team exchanges and so on. So each approach will prompt ideas to inform the construction or analysis of other data. We can use one method to construct another, and there's a number of ways of doing that. We might be doing it to inform data collection. It's the most traditional way. It's also possible to use one method to inform or modify the data analyses in another method. The important point I would make here is that this should lead from sequential to a concurrent type analysis, so that all data contribute to the final results and conclusions. What happens all too often is that, for example, someone will do some focus groups and then run a survey, and the focus groups or the interviews that they've done to design the survey are then totally forgotten and ignored. And I would argue that they are still providing valuable data that should be integrated into the final results in the write-up of the results. We can compare. So another strategy is to compare to identify patterns of similarity and difference. And the popular way at the moment of doing that is to create a joint display where different sources or data types are placed side by side in order to compare and contrast across themes. And you may end up with, this would be one line from it, where you've got what you found from the quantitative data juxtaposed with what you found from qualitative data or some other kind of data. The author clearly has used the classic qual-quant division terms here. And so this author has then, Fitzpatrick has then determined whether the results confirm each other or in fact contrast. Similarly, comparison, or not quite similarly, we can compare using a crosstab or a matrix and look for patterns. So this will typically use different kinds of data or data from different sources, from linked samples. The samples need to be linked so that you then can use the demographic or scaled data or whatever to sort the data, say, from one or more codes. So you break open and compare text for different groups. So you can do this in Excel by having categorical variables in your Excel database, as well as summaries of comments for thematic data, and then do a sort on the categorical data and see if there's a pattern of association between that and the qualitative data. So, for example, and similarly, you can do it with qualitative data software, analysis software. So, you know, an example that I often use is that if I look at the way that researchers talk about gaining satisfaction from their research, and I compare different disciplines on that, if I compare different genders on that, I don't find any noticeable differences in how they talk about gaining satisfaction. But if I compare disciplines, I do. But the scientists will talk about having agency when they're gaining satisfaction from research, and the social scientists will talk about achieving change or achieving something. So there's different ways of talking about the same general concept, depending on, in that case, demographic differences. But it might also, that's just showing how it can be obtained, that data can be obtained using, in that case, in vivo. But yeah, the differences might be demographic, they are here again, but they could also be based on a scaled variable. And so you might have differences in, say, the level of pain measured in on a visual analog scale, but also have how people talk about pain. And you can associate how they talk about pain with how they've scored their level of pain on a visual analog scale. And that gives you all kinds of possibilities of testing the validity of the scale, or just simply understanding what the scale means. How this works out in qual software is that the software will usually give you the frequencies, the variation in frequencies with which different groups talk about a particular topic, but it also gives you the actual text or qualitative data, so that you can compare how they talk about it. So you get both what they talk about, how often they talk about it, and how they talk about it. The important thing is always to not simply report that this group talked about this more than that, but also to explain the how. So there's a whole range, I've already suggested one about interpreting scale scores and so on, a range of ways in which comparative analyses can be used. And what you're doing there is bringing together different kinds of data to give you a deeper understanding of the components of that data or of the data as a whole. And the final group that I will talk about here is converting or transforming data in order to give you a dual perspective. And I will treat this one fairly quickly to allow time for questions. But basically, you can convert qualitative codes to numeric variables, and that allows you to get counts. And there's all kinds of provisos about what kinds of counts are used for what purposes and so on, which are described in either an article by Sandalowski and friends or in my book on integrating analyses. I go into some depth on that. But they can be used for statistical analyses and in descriptive type statistics or even potentially inferential ones, assuming that certain assumptions can be met, or in multivariate analyses. The conversion, the opposite way around, can be used, so you can use quantitative data to build a narrative, either profiling individuals or groups or using, let's say, Cox's regression on panel data to produce a narrative through event history analysis. You can use converted data to build a consolidated database where you combine elements of your text data that's been converted into variables plus your variable data, or you can use it to create blended variables where you create new variables based on combining elements of both. Okay, so what I've got here is just simply those points in a bit more detail. I have incidentally made the a PDF of these slides available, so those of you that want to examine the detail more, hopefully we'll be able to get a copy of that. Yeah, so we can create a what's called a case by variable database by converting interpretive codes to numeric variables and then use those for either descriptive or inferential type statistics. I have a warning there about statistical assumptions and also emphasize the need to always consider results in relation to the original qualitative data. The other way that you can look at conversion is to look for something like frequency of intersections in coding and generate some exploratory multivariate statistics. And these do things like cluster analysis, multidimensional scaling or correspondence analysis that allow you to visualize patterns or clusters or dimensions. I won't go into depth on these, but basically just to say that that's possible and that they don't have the same sampling or data distribution requirements. You don't necessarily need normalized data. You don't need to have a random probability-based sample in order to be able to do that. And the other thing is that you can do some of these kinds of analyses from a case by variable table, but if you can use qualitative data analysis software and generate from it a similarity matrix or a profile matrix that's based on actual intersections, based on specific elements of the data and not just the overall case. So instead of saying that case number 23 talks about this and about that, it actually only counts it if they talk about this and that on exactly the same piece of data. So there's a real advantage there in using qualitative counts generated through qualitative data analysis software, based on the intersections that it will generate.
There are a little bit of questions. There are a little bit of questions starting to accumulate in our Q&A.
Okay, and so I'm up to basically planning on finishing. Yeah,
perfect.
So
perfect,
just to say that these methods can be used in combination, and they allow you to make use of whatever data are available. You can deepen analysis, benefit understanding, and emphasizing finally that when you write the thing up, that you need to integrate the results by organizing around the topic. And essentially, that was it. And I'll maybe go back to that slide, and questions welcome.
Great. Thank you very, very, very much, Pat, for your brilliant presentation. And there were quite a few metaphors used that are absolutely brilliant, and we enjoy them very much. But I will first give ahead to the questions that are in the Q&A. So the first question is by Tova. Tova is a student in anthropology, and she wrote that sometimes she encounters a gap or even differences between questionnaires' information and information received from interviews or observations. So her question is, how can the different pieces of information be integrated in a coherent way?
Well, so the key is whether they are around the same topic. And there is an article by Emma Pritchard, Pritchard and Dorney. It's a Journal of Mixed Methods research article from 2019, where they talk about the problem of data diffraction and where different kinds of data are actually taking different cuts on the data and not show, so you lose the unity that you need to be able to bring it together, because you've actually taken cuts that are actually capturing different components of the data, of the phenomenon, or even different phenomena. And so the important thing is the unity then of the phenomenon that you are studying and of the question that you're asking, and the purpose, and making sure that all the data contributes to that purpose. Okay. So it is possible to end up with conflicting bits of data, and it may be because of the methodology you've chosen, or it might be because you've taken a rather different cut on the data, on the phenomenon itself.
So you're saying perhaps some more thought needs to be given to the phenomenon in question, to the definition of the phenomenon in question, actually.
And which particular aspects you're looking at, or
Right.
Yeah. And then in terms of bringing it together, the different parts together, then it's a matter of working through whichever of those integrative strategies is going to be most helpful. Or a number of them, and typically a study will use a combination of those strategies.
Okay. Sarah is asking about. She says that she conducts interviews, but she's not from the academic field, and she doesn't really work in a structured way most of the time. I would say I use my gut feeling and intuition when I interview, digest information and share it. Using my gut feeling doesn't sound very technical and professional, but is that a phenomenon that is considered and talked about in what you have seen so far in mixing methodology? Is there a technical or academic value to the researcher's intuition?
Absolutely. And you'll use your intuition to guide you, but it also needs to be backed up by solid examination of the data that you're obtaining, so that in those interviews you'll use your intuition to guide you in further ways, but then check through the data and make sure that your intuition is based on the data that you've already obtained. And yeah, I mean, the grounded theorist works that way to a very large extent.
Right. Absolutely, absolutely. There is another question by Hezkel Lane, and he asks if what is your take about Charles Ragin's qualitative comparative analysis? Is it, in your view, a genuine mixed methods approach?
I call it a hybrid method. So I call QCA and social network analysis using GIS. Those sorts of methods I tend to label as hybrid methods because they inherently combine elements of both what would typically be called qual and quant approaches. So QCA starts from interview or qualitative data, starts from and it is then categorized dichotomized according to a number of variables. So you're generating from it a truth table and then applying Boolean algebra to it. So it doesn't fit the stock standard statistical methods, but it still uses numbers and it uses algebraic methods. But they are interpreted also qualitatively and in relation to the original qualitative data.
Right.
And the argument of some people is that QCA is a purely deductive type approach, but Reagan would say that it's designed to give you ideas and understanding about leads to follow up,
right,
rather than a definitive causal answer.
Exactly. Work in progress. Right.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of more questions, but I would like first to open, if someone of the participants wants to open her or his mic and ask a live question, that would be great. But if
I think they can't open the mic, but they could ask us to open it for them. But maybe you ask your question and that will give time for people.
It's a big one. It's a big one, but I will dare to ask it anyway. Some of us do teach qualitative methodologies. My question is, how do you reckon the formation of a mixed method scholar needs to look like?
A mixed methods
scholar, a mixed method, the person who applies mixed methods research methodologies. So what his or her formation needs to look like?
Okay. So they need, they do need to understand some of what has been traditionally called quantitative methods as well. Well, I don't know. I have a particular advantage because, I did psychology in the 60s and you were trained in
basically
statistics.
Quantitative, right.
Yeah, absolutely. Trained in statistics. And I am always appreciative of that background in my training. The fact that I went to a much more mixed approach during my PhD era, I still didn't actually recognize it as such. That label wasn't around then. It didn't exist. But that's, when I look back, that's what I did. It sort of got me into trouble as well because I was in psychology and it was not very acceptable to some psychology markers. But anyway, that's another story. So I appreciate that background training and the more qualitative side, the understanding and working with text, I've had to work out a lot more because I wasn't trained in that.
Right.
And I've, basically had to develop that through mentoring by some very experienced qualitative researchers. And so that was hugely important for me, and reading and studying. So there needs to be that breadth of understanding. You may work in a team where you can be the qualitative specialist, but you still need to have at least a basic understanding of what other people are talking about when they use numbers or statistics, and to understand, the essential nature of, things like central limit theorem and stuff like that, variation, right, and statistical variation and probability, a concept of probability, so that you don't get someone. I've read articles where someone it was an article I was reviewing, and they were comparing differences in two groups, and because both groups each talked about most things that they were looking at, they focused on the one thing where only one group talked about it, but it was only one person in that group that talked about it, but that's what they focused on because nobody in the other group did. It was a complete misunderstanding of probability and the importance of what differences really meant statistically. So you need a bit of both, but obviously you can be an expert in one more than the other, and your group will be more well trained in the qualitative area, but they need to appreciate that numbers tell them things. And in fact, the statisticians would say that ordinal numbers are qualitative in any case.
That's true. That's true. That's true. I think that the key word here is the appreciate, because it's not only knowing and understanding, but also appreciating what is the potential benefit of knowing both the different methodologies, right?
Yeah.
So I think that in a sense you were lucky, because you were very aware of the fact that you were based on, you were educated mostly as a quantitative, but then you had to perform yourself in the qualitative area. Whereas now the pressure for conducting mixed methods research from the start needs to be very effective in terms of training of persons as mixed method researchers from the beginning. So I'm still debating with myself to what extent we should give time to digest and elaborate both quantitative and qualitative methodologies apart, and to the point to bring them and combine them together in a class. For pedagogic from the pedagogic standpoint.
Yeah, clearly at some points you're going to have lectures which deal just with statistics and what they mean, and lectures that deal with, here are some different ways of approaching text, but always to develop an appreciation of the other. And to frame design always in terms of what's best going to answer my question, rather than how can we design a quantitative study or how can we design a qualitative study. So frame design always in that term, of that more general term.
Right, great, thank you.
I'd like to ask you to go back a minute for the first question asked about the different answer received by different methods, and wonder a bit more about it, because I think it's also a question of what kind of data you combine. And I find it especially difficult to combine surveys with interviews, because I think that sometimes the context of, the way you are asked a question could bring you answer it differently. I could see a situation in which I fill a survey and I say that I'm I don't know, I like something or I'm in favor of something. But when I talk about it in an interview, I will present a very paradoxical or complex relationship with this entity. And then when you combine the survey and the interview together, you would receive different answers that are influenced by the context of
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so they're giving you perhaps different views, and you have to think about how the methodology is affecting the way that a person is answering. And is there a constraint offered by the survey, or is there a constraint offered within the interview that's not present in the other? And sometimes the survey will give you a more open answer, and sometimes the interview will, because you've built a rapport with the interviewee. There is a quite wonderful article written, which is available on the National Centre for Research Methods website in Britain, by Green, Stathan and Solomou, and they were interviewing people about their experience of genetic counselling, and they were having them fill out basically a satisfaction scale, but talking to them about the same item at the same time. And they analysed the discrepancies between how people filled out the scale and what they said. And they came up with a whole list of different ways in which discrepancies were created. So that's quite an interesting. It was about 2006, I think it was done. But
I look for it.
Quite an interesting article and an interesting exercise in analysing those discrepancies. But yeah, there will be, typically will be, because the different methods give you access to different kinds of data, as you say, the context makes a huge difference. Analysing why those differences occur can tell you a lot more potentially about the subject matter. Why is it that sometimes people are secretive in one form of response and not in the other? There's another study by Mitu and Temple, I think, and it's on the in the International Journal of Qualitative Methods, the one that comes out of Canada. Anyway, yeah. It's an electronic journal, and they analysed diabetes patients and whether how honestly they reported their dietary adherence. And there were differences again between diaries and reports. And sorry, I'm struggling now to remember the exact nature of the differences, but one was about whether they were prepared to disclose or not in one form or the other. So that's another article that deals with that kind of thing and actually looks at the differences. That's quite interesting. There's one out of Israel as well, Nemo and Sloven Nemo, or some I think that's the name, something like that. Again, published in JMMR some years ago, looking at children in schools who were, now I'm pushing to remember because it's a while since I've read it.
I'm already impressed by how much you remember the names.
It's all of these are referenced in my text on integrating analyses. So yeah. But so there are some key articles which are really helpful in understanding those discrepancies. Mm-hmm. Another by Udo Keller, right? Yeah, looking at people in nursing homes talking about satisfaction with services, which is a classic place to get differences between a survey and an interview. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but don't despair. Look at how the methodology is contributed, look at how the context is contributed, and that will help you to actually understand the phenomenon in more detail than you'd have if you only had one of those methods.
Right, great. So we have come to the end of our session, and I would like to again thank you very, very much for being with us today and for opening this day. The presentation will be available in the ICQM website for those who would like to follow up. And
just a small correction, those who